episode. And so what I want to do is expand upon a few of the key areas where I received the most, let's just say, strong critique. And one thing I do appreciate is when I post content, especially on Instagram and TikTok, I do get a lot of feedback. I always, whether it's good or bad. And so I am very grateful for that because it provides me a lot of material and content to work with. And so where we're going to be going today is I'm going to be looking at a few more of the what I like to call players or characters in the unseen realm, because it's more than just angels and demons. And so I alluded to a few of them in episode 11, and so I want to list a few more and dive a little bit deeper into more of the characters that we see in the Bible, as well as some more of the conspiratorial characters that may or may not be real, but I'm going to quickly chat about them. Secondly, I received a ton of critique on my viewpoint that I don't think demons are fallen angels. I just barely alluded to it, but I received so many comments. So I'm going to explain why I don't think that demons are fallen angels. And so maybe you can get just a bit more of an understanding of where I'm coming from, because apparently hundreds of you disagree with me. And then also I did allude to the fact where in Revelation chapter 12, I don't believe that is describing the ultimate rebellion to where the devil fell with a third of the angels, and how that theology, that doctrine has been so prevalent in our churches. Well, I don't think that that's what that text is talking about. And so I received literally hundreds of comments and messages calling me a lot of mean things because I think that. So I want to explain a little bit more into why I think that. And then finally, I received a question a number of times from different people. And the question is simply, what's the point? Like, why am I talking about this? What is the point? How does it help how does it help our walk with Jesus? How does it help us get closer to him? Which I think is a great question. And so I want to just quickly answer that and share my thoughts on why I think these kind of subjects are super important, especially in the times that we live today in our walk with God. So that is where we're going in this episode. But before we get there, as always, I just want to remind you all, if you haven't yet followed me on Instagram and TikTok and on YouTube, you can follow me there at the handle The Tattooed Preacher. I literally post daily on TikTok and Instagram, trying to get more aggressive with YouTube. But go subscribe to my channel there. Come hang out with me, TikTok and Instagram. And also, if you're listening to this or on Apple Podcasts, if you could just kindly leave a nice 5-star review, that would help me out, make me smile, and just help get this podcast out a bit deeper into the sea of podcasts, because there are a lot of them. So that is my social media plug. So now it's going to be a good episode today. So sit back, relax. Who lives in the unseen realm? And as I mentioned in the last episode, I alluded to a few different beings that inhabit the spiritual realm, the unseen realm, whatever term you want to use. And so I thought I would just make a list, and it's not exhaustive, 13 different ways that beings in the unseen realm are referred to, as well as a list of about 8 or 9 mythological creatures that are alluded to in extra biblical texts. And so the whole point in me going through this stuff, it's not going to be an exhaustive study. And again, it doesn't cover all of them. But the main point that I want to get across is that the unseen realm, the spiritual realm, is so much more than just angels and demons. Like that is the big idea here. And I think a lot of people are so comfortable, a lot of Christians are so comfortable in their thinking that there's just angels and demons and that's it, that any talk of anything else is just it's too difficult to wrap their head around. And so what I want to do is just go through some verses that speak of different creatures. Now, there may be some overlap here, but again, I just want to show you that there's just more than angels and demons, and that people, regular people like you and I, have encounters, have experiences with a lot of these that they talk about. That's why I'm doing this. So, again, no particular order. I'm just gonna go through them and just to put them on your radar. And if something, I don't know, triggers your curiosity, then you can do your own further study into these things. Okay. And so the first one I want to mention is the term holy ones. We see this littered throughout the entire Old Testament, and Psalm 89 verses 5-7 says this. It says, "The heavens will praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness also, and the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord, a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him." So here we see there is an assembly, there's some sort of heavenly council of holy ones, beings that surround God, surround his throne in this particular scene. And then in Job 15, we see something interesting as well. Job 15 verse 15 says this, says, "Behold, he, being God, has no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight." So here we see the term holy ones used again, except it's not used in a positive light. It shows that God actually doesn't, just because someone's a spiritual being, divine being, surrounding the throne of God, doesn't automatically mean they're necessarily someone worth trusting, because God clearly doesn't trust all of them. And so you have, I guess, good holy ones, you got some untrustworthy holy ones, but this is one way the Bible refers to, again, divine beings, holy ones. Next is the term spirits. Now, we're often used to seeing this term in the New Testament, talking term of spirits or unclean spirits, referring to demons. But did you know that they're actually, in the Old Testament, the writers make reference to spirits as well. And so in 1 Kings chapter 22, there's another heavenly council meeting going on between God and some other divine beings. And this is what it says. It says, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the angels of heaven standing by him," which angels, we're familiar with that. That's like the go-to term. "The angels of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" Now check this out. "And one spirit said this, while another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him." So we have this reference to angels, which we're all familiar with, but then the writer also calls them spirits, which, again, I thought is fascinating because I get the term spirit in a New Testament context, but what about an Old Testament context? Are spirits just another way of saying angels, of describing angels? Or are they a different being altogether? I don't know. Something to think about. So we have holy ones, now we have spirits, we have angels, and another term is the term stars. Now, in ancient Near Eastern thinking, when they looked up at the sky, they saw the planets, they saw the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they saw the stars move, right? Shooting stars and all that kind of stuff. And so in their perspective, in their minds, they thought, oh, they're alive. They're actually divine beings. And so oftentimes in the scriptures, divine beings, spiritual beings are considered stars. And so in Job 38, verse 5-7, here's a very famous verse that talks about this. It says, who set its measurements, since you know, or who stretched the measuring line over it? This is God speaking to Job about the earth. On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? So we talked about sons of God in episode 11. That's another term to describe divine beings, beings that live in the unseen realm. But here we see them described as stars who sang together at the point of creation. So again, stars, is this just another way of describing a being that already exists, or could this potentially be describing another kind of divine being? So we got stars. Another term is the term watcher. Now, I love this one. And in Daniel chapter 4, the writer writes, he says, I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. So we see the term holy one again, but we also see this term watcher, an angelic watcher. And now when you do a bit of a deeper dive study into this text, you will discover that in a lot of extra biblical texts that the disciples read, that Jesus read, that was circulating the early church, they talk a lot about watchers. And last week, when we talked about when the sons of God came down and mated with the human women, in the book of Enoch, those sons of God, as it described in Genesis 6, in Enoch, they're described as watchers. Again, another way to describe a spiritual being in the unseen realm, which I thought was pretty cool. Then we got the cherubim, we got the seraphim, right? These are the guardian throne angels, or they're guardian throne watchers. And the most famous one, Ezekiel 28, talks about Satan, right? God says this, he says, you are the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. And so a lot of scholars, a lot of biblical scholars would say that the devil himself was a guardian cherub. He was around the throne of God before he fell. And so we have cherubim, we have seraphim. Then another interesting term that we'll see, especially in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is the term Rephaim. Now, one definition of this that I found in a biblical dictionary was that this term can mean giants, it can mean shades, meaning spirits of the dead, or it could mean simply the dead. And this variation in translation highlights the main interpretive difficulty surrounding the term. So were the Rephaim humans, whether living or dead? Were they quasi-divine beings? Or were they disembodied spirits? And so we see this term described in these 3 different ways interchangeably. And so disembodied spirits, disembodied dead, quasi-divine beings. I mean, are these 3 different entities? Are these 3 ways of describing the same thing? I mean, again, I will leave that to your study to go a little bit deeper. And they also are described as the giants. So one term describing 3 different characters or 3 different entities that inhabit the unseen realm. Then we got the Nephilim that we talked about last week, right? These are the offspring of the Watchers or the sons of God when they came to earth, mated with human women. They produced offspring known as the Nephilim. These are the giants. These were the heroes of old. These were the men of renown. These were the guys that all of the ancient mythologies all around the world get their stories from when you talk about Greek mythology, Roman mythology, when you have the gods and humans and demigods and all that kind of stuff. This is where I believe all of that stuff comes from. This is the genesis of all mythology. We have the Nephilim, and then we have demons. In the last episode, I said were the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. So when these giants, when they died, right, they were half human, half divine. So their human bodies died, but their spirits were not just a human spirit, and so they were kind of left to roam the earth, kind of in this in-between zone. And these were the spirits that Jesus encountered in the Gospels. This is why they have to possess, because they still crave a host body to do their bidding and to function the way that they want to function. And so that's what I believe demons are. Then the next one, territorial spirits, or they're described as princes or rulers or dominions or thrones. And so, for example, in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, we see the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now, here's the story. So when Daniel was praying, it says for 21 days, Daniel was praying. That's where we get the 21-day Daniel fast. And then we see in Daniel 10 that Michael, one of the archangels, was caught up in a conflict with the prince of Persia for 21 days. God wanted Michael to go give Daniel a message, but it took Michael 21 days to fight through that conflict with the prince of Persia. And so there are entities, there are beings that rule over nations and cities and regions, certain territories that they have. That is their dominion, that where they can control and influence what happens in those specific areas. And so this is why I personally believe, right, when nations or cities or regions, if there's a lot of demonic activity that's happening, if there's a lot of stuff that's just not good, there's a very good chance that there is an entity or entities that in the heavenlies, in the spiritual realm, in the unseen realm, they are influencing what's being established. They are influencing what's happening. And I think this is what's happening because I'm from Canada. And when you look at a lot of this, those of us Canadians, when you look at a lot of the policies and stuff that are getting established, getting put through, and you see all the craziness that's happening, Paul says we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, rulers, thrones, dominions, all those kind of things that we're being influenced in the spiritual realm, and it's affecting the natural realm. And so this is why as Christians we got to pray, we got to stand together, we got to do battle in the spiritual realm, because that's where the fight is. You can go after politicians and you can try to get them in the courts and try to get them to overturn policies, but that's not the root issue. The root issue is, I believe, the territorial spirits and entities that are in the heavenly places that are influencing what's happening in the nation, in the provinces, and in the cities of Canada, and then also around the world. I think there are entities that control regions and countries and nations and all that. And that's where the fight is. And so those are territorial spirits. And so those are, that wasn't exhaustive, and I went quick through some of those, but those are different ways that different creatures, different characters, different beings that inhabit the unseen realm, this is the way that they're described in the Bible. And again, so just from that, there's just a lot more than just angels and demons. It's a lot more complex than we'd realize. Now, before we move on, I did want to mention some of the mythological creatures. And so this may sound a bit crazy to some of you, and that's fine. The first time I heard it, I thought it was nuts too. But I've been on a journey over the last number of years, and God's really smashed my paradigm over and over again. And I have just more of a capacity to engage in certain ideas and thoughts that before I would have not been able to even process. And so what I want to suggest is this. that, as I mentioned last episode in more detail, that when the sons of God, the Watchers, came to earth in Genesis 6 and mated with human women, and they created the Nephilim, the offspring, these half human, half divine beings, that alongside of that, we'll find in extra biblical texts, so other books like First Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Jasher, I think the book of the Giants, these other extra biblical texts that are not in the Bible, but they were writings that influenced the writers of the Bible. For example, in Peter and in Jude, they actually quote from the book of First Enoch. So these were pieces of literature that influenced the early church, that influenced the apostles, the disciples, and that Jesus actually read as well. All right, so take that as you may. But when you read these texts, when it's describing what happened at Genesis 6, you'll find that alongside of the creating of the Nephilim, the giants, half human, half divine, that these beings actually were engaged in procreating with animals, the animal kingdom. And then they also were involved in this genetic manipulation, mixing animal with animal. And so when you get into certain mythologies, you'll see these creatures like, forgive me if I pronounce these wrongs, but the centaurs, the satyrs, and the minotaurs. So those human horse hybrids, or the human goat hybrids, or the human bull hybrids that we see in different mythologies. These extra biblical texts suggest that they were actually real beings, real creatures that were created during this time in the pre-flood world. That they weren't just these creatures made up in someone's mind and then thrown into mythology, but the mythology actually followed true events. And what's interesting is there is a lot of data that would suggest from different people's experiences that people are still seeing these creatures today. And so I just want to say that it's a fascinating thought experiment to think about. But to me, if you can get your head around Genesis 6 and the hybrid human divine being creations that the Nephilim, or that the sons of God created when they made it with human women, then it is not that far of a stretch to say, well, then they could have done the same things with the animal kingdom. And they had some kind of technology or intellect or intelligence, and they knew back then how to perform genetic manipulation on different species and mix them together to create other crazy creatures that people are still seeing. And so I just want to throw it out there that I'm probably like 70-30 in believing that they're real and that that's actually legit. That's kind of where I land on it. I'm not 100%, but I think that I'm leaning more and more towards that these suckers may actually be real. And then when you get into other creatures like Bigfoot or Dogman or werewolves or vampires, and again, aliens, the various kinds of aliens, then you get into ghosts, it's not as far-fetched and conspiratorial as it's often believed. Because there's people literally all over the globe who claim to have these experiences. And here's the thing, if even one account is true, one, it busts the paradigm. It changes things. And so I just want to, again, encourage you, we can't be so narrow-minded in our thinking. The unseen realm is so much more complicated than I think we realize, and it's not just angels and demons. There is a lot more going on, and I think a lot of people are encountering them and are having these experiences, and they all just can't be a lie. Like, there's too many coincidences. There's too many people having similar experiences from all over the world who don't know each other with corroborating stories. So I'm going to leave that there. But I just want to say that the unseen realm is so much more complicated and complex and real than I think most Christians care to believe or even think about. So we'll stop there. Now, moving on. The second thing I want to address, and this is two parts, is I want to address why I don't think fallen angels are demons. And then I want to address this notion, this common belief that Revelation 12 speaks about when the devil fell with a third of the angels. And this is describing that great rebellion. Okay, so I want to tackle these two things. So first, why I think fallen angels are not demons. Now, one theologian wrote this. He says, this notion is ubiquitous in popular Christian books and preaching. Like, it is the predominant view that demons are fallen angels are demons. And so when I posted a clip from episode 11 on social media, like, I got literally hundreds of comments, DMs, people saying I'm out to lunch, that I'm preaching heresy, I'm a false teacher, I'm misguided, I'm misinformed, I'm leading people astray. Like, people went nuts. And this is the stuff that they're coming at me with as part of why I'm wrong, is that this belief that when the angels fell with the devil, that they turned into demons. Or that, you know what, maybe there's just different classes of demons. Or that every evil creature is just a different kind of demon. Or they're only angels and demons, and that's just it, right? And so I got variations of those comments, but that is what I received 100-fold. But as we just looked at above in the last section, this clearly can't be the case that there's just angels and demons. Like, there are so many more beings, and things are just way more complex. They're just not that simple. And so we can't just say that demons are just fallen angels and angels are just demons. Even though that's what church tradition has led us to believe, it's just, I think that this whole thing came from an incorrect interpretation of Revelation chapter 12. So I think this, and again, I could be wrong, but from my growing up in the church, from what I was taught growing up, and from what I've heard from hundreds and hundreds of other believers, this is where I think it all began. This false idea, this false idea that, in my opinion, where fallen angels and demons just kind of merge together and to become one. And it's Revelation chapter 12. And so I'm just going to quickly read the first 10 verses here. All right? Just so that we're all on the same page and we all understand the context. So, Revelation 12, verses 1 to 10 says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his heads were 7 crowns, and his tail swept a third of the stars of heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who was going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, and there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was a war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they did not prevail. So this is the text. And you'll notice that you see this statement talking about a great red dragon, where his tail swept away a third of the stars and hurled them to the earth. Now, when you drop down to verse 13, you'll also see this. It says, when the dragon saw that he'd been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman. So you have this red dragon being thrown down to earth, and along with him were a third of the stars, which we also learned are divine beings. And in this context, they're typically defined as angels. And so people take this text and then they've just simply decided, oh, this is when the devil fell. And he took a third of the angels with him. And this is how the devil got his army. And so then you have the devil and then you have demons. They just got merged together. But see, here's the thing. We got to do some basic Bible study here. Okay, you can't just take a verse and pull it out of its context and then decide what it means. Because when you actually understand the context here, and I'm going to get into this deeper in just a minute, but the context here is not describing a great rebellion and a great fall when the devil rebelled and was thrown out of heaven with a third of the angels. The context of Revelation chapter 12 is the birth of the Messiah. It's the birth of Jesus. And so was there a war described here? Yes. But this war is not depicting this great rebellion where the devil then is thrown out of heaven with a third of the angels, who then all of a sudden are now going to be called fallen angels, who are then now going to be called demons. Like, that is not how you do Bible study. That is not the context of here. And so in the last episode, I already talked about the origin of demons, right? The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, of the giants. So there were no Nephilim giants in heaven. The fallen angels, the angels that fell with the devil, whenever this rebellion was, they were not the Nephilim. Fallen angels are not the Nephilim. The Nephilim is the offspring of them. So they cannot be the demons, because the demons are the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. Now, I know it's confusing. Maybe some of your heads are like, what is this guy talking about? I know it's confusing. But one writer, he said this, one of my favorite biblical scholars, he said, nevertheless, demons are consistently cast as disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim and their giant clan descendants. Those spirits are the offspring of the angels that sinned before the flood, so the demons cannot be those fallen angels. So demons and fallen angels are different entities. The fallen angels that fell with the devil, whenever that was, joined him in his great rebellion, yes, but they did not just all of a sudden morph into what we call demons. Are fallen angels demonic? Sure, I can give you that. Are they malevolent? Are fallen angels malevolent? Yes. Are they evil? Yes. Are they anti-God? Yes. But that does not mean that they are the specific entity that we would call a demon. Angels are not spirits. They're not unclean spirits. They don't possess. Why? Because they already have a body. This is why demons need to have host bodies, right? Because they're disembodied. They were at one point bodied in the Nephilim. They were the giants. They were at one point. They may have even be the disembodied spirits of those crazy mythological creatures, the satyrs, the centaurs, the minotaurs. When those spirits, if they're half divine, half animal, when those beings died, they could be the disembodied spirits of those too. But they're disembodied. They're not bodied. And that's my point. So this is why I don't think that this is a correct reading of Revelation 12. Just because angels fell with the devil does not, and because they're evil and they're rebellious, does not all of a sudden mean that they are demons. I'm not sure if I explained that correctly, but that's what I think. That's what I believe. Now, secondly, I got so much feedback, even more aggressive than the demons and fallen angels thing that I said, but I posted another video specifically saying how Revelation 12 doesn't describe the war in heaven when the devil was cast out with a third of the angels. Now, you talk about passionate people. I got so many comments, like brutal comments. I was being sworn at. people were calling me every name in the book. And these are Christian people, because they could not understand how I could say what I said, how I could make that video. And a lot of the people that were more nice, and they were just kind of like, hey, Joel, like, what are you talking about? Like, the verses actually talk about the devil being thrown out of heaven and a third of the angels going with him, a star, like the stars. Like, it actually says that. So, like, what are you even saying? See, well, here's the thing. This is why I changed because I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and this was the common belief. This is where the devil fell with a third of the angels. And this is describing what happened right here. But as I already mentioned, see, here's the thing. You have to understand context when you read the Bible. Context is king. It's so important. It's so paramount. It is the only way to actually read the Bible correctly. And when you read Revelation chapter 12, when you actually read it, Revelation 12 is speaking of the birth of Jesus. I mean, we already read it. And in the first few verses, it says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And then you go further down, and it says, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth. And when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male who was going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. This is speaking of the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. This is the context. This verse is not speaking of the primordial war in heaven, the war that took place back in ancient times when the devil decided enough is enough, I want to be like God, and God kicked him out. This is not describing that event. What we see here are the events surrounding the birth and the life and the death of Jesus being described in astrological terms. And that's a whole other subject that's way above my head that I can't fully understand or explain. But I've heard a lot of teaching on Revelation is very astrological, talking about the position of the stars and the planets, and it's all connected here. That tells a story. And so in the heavenlies, yes, there is a war being described here. The great dragon was thrown from heaven to earth, and it does say his tail swept a third of the stars with him. Yes, but there is no verse here that talks about the context being this primordial rebellion. You can't just take that and say, oh, well, that's what it means. If the context is talking about the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, if that's the context, then you can't all of a sudden just then take these other verses and just say, no, this is actually what it means. The context is the birth of Jesus. And so it can't mean that. But yes, I want to say this. Yes, there was a war. At some point in the past, there was a primordial war that took place in heaven where the devil fell. He took angels with him. And they became fallen angels. They became his army, his host, to do all his bidding. That did happen. My point is that it wasn't Revelation chapter 12. I know it's convenient to think that. I know as humans, especially modern humans who live in the 21st century, that we love to know things. We have to have answers, that we have to look at the Bible and answer the question, well, when did the devil fall? And so we have to find that answer. And so then we'll go to Revelation 12 and we'll see a text that seems to suggest that. And then we run with it because it makes us feel good, makes us feel like we actually know the answer. The problem is context. And so I'm not going to belabor that point. Demons are not fallen angels. Fallen angels are not demons. And Revelation 12 does not speak of the great primordial rebellion where the devil was cast out of heaven. This is speaking of a different situation. It was speaking of a different set of circumstances. It was speaking of a war that was taking place surrounding the birth, the life, the death, and the ascension of Jesus. And it was being used in astrological term and imagery. And that's the context. And I'm sticking to it. And then finally, I got this question a lot, as I mentioned. And the question is, how does talking about these things help us in our walk with Jesus? How does it help us grow in our relationship? Basically, what is the point? And I received this a number of times, and it kind of struck me when I read it, because I had never really thought about it in that way. To me, when I started learning about this stuff, it was so fascinating to me that I just jumped in and I didn't really even question it. But taking a step back and looking at and hearing people's hearts as they ask it, I'm like, you know what, this would be a good question to answer, because I think studying this stuff is so important. And so the first reason why I think it's important is it should be our responsibility as Christians to understand as best we can, given our resources, to dive as deep into the mind of the authors and the audience of the text that we can. We should strive as best we can to put our 21st century mindset aside and adopt the mindset of the biblical world. When we do that, as I hope that you are seeing from these last 2 episodes and going forward, you're going to see that there's so much more going on in the Bible than we know. And so the first reason why I think that it's important to study this, it's important to look at these topics, is because it's our job as Christians to understand the text, to understand the Bible. It's our job to get into the mind of the audience, to get to the mind of the authors, to discover what the text actually talks about. And because when we do that, these are the things that we discover. We discover that there's a whole unseen realm that we know nothing about, filled with beings and creatures and things that are so complex and so far removed from our everyday lives, but that influence each and every one of us more than we know. And so when we don't study the text, when we don't do our due diligence and respect and honor God's word and dive deep into it to ingest it, then we leave ourselves open to becoming deceived, open to believing stuff that's not true, and creating these theological narratives, these theological or doctrines that aren't true. And so I think that it's so important to talk about, because we're so much more influenced by the unseen realm than we realize. I mean, Hosea chapter 4 verse 6 says this. It says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And so when we lack the knowledge, then how can we understand stuff? Sounds so cliche, sounds so basic, but it's so true. And so many Christians, if you look at the stats, are very biblically illiterate. The majority of Christians don't even read their Bibles. And so that is a very dangerous place to be in. So the first reason is because it's our responsibility as Christians to understand as best we can what God's word says. And when we do that, we will discover that the unseen realm is so much more complex and powerful and influential than we realize. And then secondly, I think this is important to talk about, because there are literally millions of people all over the world, Christian and non-Christian, who are having these encounters and these experiences with these beings, with these creatures that live in the unseen realm, and they have nowhere to go to talk about it. If a Christian has an encounter, let's say with an alien, or a Christian has an encounter with a watcher, or a Christian has an encounter with another one of these beings, and they go to church with it and they try to talk about it, oftentimes they're just looked at as crazy. And I know that because I was the person on the other side calling them crazy. I've grown up in the church my whole life, and I've pastored on various different levels of pastoring. And I've pretty much seen and heard it all when it comes to church. And I've heard crazy stories. See, but back then I had no grid for this stuff. My framework was just, oh, there's just angels and demons, and everything evil is just a demon. And that was it. And so when someone came at me with an insane story, or I heard a story, I'm just like, either I thought they were nuts and it's not true, or I was like, oh, that's just a demon. And it completely shuts people off. It doesn't validate their experience. It doesn't honor their experiences. And so I think that if the church doesn't wake up to the fact that there's so much more going on, and then you have all of these people who are having these experiences and the encounters, and the church isn't addressing them, then they're going to go somewhere else to get their answers. And the other places that they're going to go are going to feed them nothing but garbage. This is why Ancient Aliens is a massive hit on TV, and why so many people watch that. And it's preaching their own false gospel, and people are eating it up. Why? Because the church doesn't address it. And so I think this is important to talk about, because people are having experiences that they have no grid for, that they can't explain, that they have no reference point for. And as Christians, we as the church, we have to be a place where we have to catch up. We got to take God out of the box that we've put him in. Take our nice, comfortable little Christianity, our nice, comfortable theologies that we've constructed because it's easy, it's palatable, and we got to allow God to smash that, because if we don't, we are going to be becoming more and more irrelevant, and people are going to be looking elsewhere, and they already are looking elsewhere for their answers. And again, one of my favorite quotes is, if even one account is true, it busts the paradigm. Meaning, in all of the thousands and the millions of experiences and encounters that people are having with these crazy creatures, these divine beings, these characters that live in the unseen realm, it all can't be a lie. And if even one's true, it busts that paradigm. And so I've become, and personally for me, I've just become very passionate about, I just want to understand what's true. And so God's taking me through this journey of smashing my paradigm and rebuilding it, and smashing it and rebuilding it, and smashing it and rebuilding it, to where I can actually have conversations about things that 5 years ago I couldn't have even thought about, let alone have a conversation about. And it doesn't mean I agree or believe with everything that I hear. But the point is, I'm able to have conversations now about things, about topics that for so long were just deemed conspiratorial and fake and a bunch of nonsense. The reality is, a lot of those things are actually, there's validity to them and truth. And so I want to get to a place where I just want to understand truth as best as I can. And so I can have an influence and be able to have conversations with people. Because, man, like, especially the day and age that we're living with, where everyone has their own platform now, and there's so much stuff being spewed online via social media. I just want to be able to take these experiences that people have and put a biblical perspective on them. But typical biblical theology has no grid or no place for a lot of this stuff, and that's the problem, and that's why this is important, and that's why I think we got to talk about this more and more. So that's my answer. So I hope that made sense. I think that's it for this episode. These are, again, just diving a bit deeper into a lot of the flack that I received in social media over the last couple of weeks. And so I did want to thank everyone who does comment on my stuff, even if you guys are really mean. It gives me a lot of content, and it gives me a lot of perspective, because it lets me know how people are thinking. So keep commenting, keep engaging. I really appreciate it. And yeah, this episode was fun. There's a lot of stuff here. I know it sounds crazy. Maybe some of you think I'm more crazy. I don't know. But I just think that I just keep coming back to the point of there's so much more going on than we know. And I just want to get to the bottom of it as much as I can. And I want more people to get to the bottom of it as much as you all can, so that we can impact this world for Jesus more and more, so that we can be a light and be a resource for people as they go through their various things and experiences that people go through. So